The alien admiral sat in the darkened war room, his eyes fixed on the screen in front of him. A young human child appeared on the screen, sitting at a small desk in a room cluttered with toys and books. The child was focused completely on the glowing screen of a simulation game. The admiral leaned forward, his fingers hovering over the console as he studied the child's every movement. His mission was clear: observe and analyze humanity's potential as a threat to the Star Empire, and humans had so far appeared no different from the other primitive species. Scattered across the galaxy, they were chaotic, emotional, and seemingly incapable of organized thought. But this child intrigued him. There was something different about the way the child interacted with the game. Unlike most humans, the child didn't seem distracted by the flashing lights or the sound effects of the game. No, instead, the child was completely absorbed, their small fingers tapping the keys with a precision the admiral found curious. The game was simple enough from his perspective. It was a strategy simulation where the player commanded fleets of ships and armies to fight against simulated alien invaders. Yet as he observed the child, he found himself questioning if this was really as simple as it appeared. The child was no older than 7, and yet their focus was unwavering. Every click of the mouse and every key press seemed deliberate and calculated. The admiral noted the child's tactical movements in the game, directing fleets to attack specific points, creating distractions to trap the virtual enemy ships in narrow corridors, and using deceptive maneuvers that led the enemy straight into their grasp. He had seen such tactics before employed by some of the greatest military minds across the galaxy, but this child had no training, no experience in combat. The admiral thought back to his own youth, how he had been trained in the art of warfare from a very young age, yet the child's actions were far more advanced than anything he had been taught at that age. A deep feeling of unease began to gnaw at him. Something was off. There was a sharpness in the child's movements that suggested an instinctive understanding of tactics, an understanding that most beings did not develop until years of formal training. The admiral's eyes narrowed as he continued to observe. He had witnessed many simulations before and was well aware of the difference between mere luck and true strategy. This was no accident. The child was playing as though they had done this before. Every move was part of a larger plan, part of an intricate web of strategy that the admiral had only seen in the most seasoned of tacticians. Was this child simply an anomaly, or was there something more, something hidden within humanity itself, something that set them apart from all other species? The admiral leaned back in his chair, lost in thought, as the child continued their virtual conquest. He had not expected to be watching a child's game, but as the minutes passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary game. This was something more, something important that he couldn't yet comprehend. The admiral continued to watch the child as they moved deeper into the game. The stakes had risen as the virtual enemy increased in strength and numbers, yet the child's calm never wavered. With each new level, the child faced increasingly complex scenarios, but their focus seemed to sharpen rather than falter. Their small fingers danced over the keyboard with an ease that suggested they were no longer merely playing, but rather commanding an army. The admiral couldn't look away. A sense of disbelief slowly started to settle in his mind. How could someone so young possess such an understanding of strategy and tactics? It was becoming more and more clear to him that this child was doing something that went far beyond simple gameplay. Every action the child took was precise and intentional, as though they were anticipating the enemy's moves before they even happened. The admiral couldn't recall ever seeing such instinctive brilliance in a human, and certainly not in one so young. As the game's difficulty escalated, the child's tactics grew even more advanced. They were no longer just responding to threats, but predicting them, staying several steps ahead of the virtual enemy. The admiral's curiosity grew into something more potent, something closer to unease. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the child manipulated the virtual battlefield. They treated every decision like it was a matter of life and death. Yet the admiral knew this was just a game, wasn't it? The child directed their forces in a way that seemed almost effortless, taking calculated risks that paid off in spades. The admiral thought back to his own training, how every tactic had been drilled into him over the years. He had learned through years of discipline and rigorous study, yet here was this child moving with an innate understanding of strategy, as though it was as natural as breathing. How was it possible that such complex decision-making could come so easily to a human child? The admiral's mind raced through every piece of information he had gathered on humanity in the past years, their history of conflict, their ability to adapt and survive. But this was something new. This was something far beyond the level of tactical understanding he had expected from a species like humanity. The admiral sat forward, his fingers tightening on the armrest of his chair. His thoughts were clouded by this unsettling realization. Humans had always been a chaotic and unpredictable species, but perhaps that was what made them so dangerous. Perhaps their greatest strength was not in their technology or in their numbers, but in their ability to think and adapt on a level that no other species had ever truly understood. This child's game was no longer something trivial, no longer just an innocent simulation. This was a glimpse into something much deeper, something far more complex about the human mind. And it was starting to dawn on the admiral that maybe humanity wasn't as primitive as he had been led to believe. Maybe they weren't just a species to be easily overlooked. The child's next move confirmed this suspicion. The admiral watched as the child divided their forces into smaller groups, using feints and diversions to break the enemy's lines, while the main force launched a surprise counterattack from the opposite direction. The admiral had seen this tactic used in real battles, but never by a child, never with such mastery. He leaned closer to the screen, the unease within him growing stronger. This was no mere game, it was preparation, and somehow the child seemed to know that they were preparing for something much greater than any game could simulate. As the game progressed, the admiral's unease turned into a quiet sense of awe. With each new wave of alien invaders, the child's tactics grew even more precise. The child was no longer just responding to attacks, but anticipating them. The enemy's moves were predictable to the child, as if they knew exactly what the virtual forces would do before they even made their move. The admiral watched closely as the child's fingers flicked across the keyboard with a level of calm that only grew as the simulation became more chaotic. It was a game of complex strategy, yet the child was making it look effortless. Every unit, every ship was positioned with a clear purpose, a clear end goal. The child didn't hesitate. They didn't second-guess their decisions. They simply executed each move as if they had practiced it 1,000 times over. The admiral's gaze narrowed, his analytical mind working overtime to decipher what was unfolding before him. How was it possible that the child was able to predict the enemy's tactics so accurately? They had no prior knowledge of these simulated alien forces, no experience with this specific scenario, yet they were playing as if they had fought in 100 similar battles. It dawned on him that the child wasn't just playing a game. They were demonstrating an instinctive understanding of warfare that defied logic and explanation. It was a mental pattern the admiral recognized only in the most advanced tacticians, the ability to read the battlefield almost intuitively. But this child had no formal training, no real-world experience, yet here they were making moves that mirrored the best military minds in the galaxy. The admiral had to wonder if this was truly a fluke, or if this child represented something deeper within the human species. As the levels advanced and the virtual battles grew larger, the child's responses grew more complex and creative. The admiral could see the tactical depth in every decision they made. The child's forces were no longer simply surviving. They were dominating the battlefield, manipulating the virtual enemies into hopeless positions where retreat was impossible. He had seen such tactics in battle commanders who had decades of experience, yet here it was in a child no older than 7 years. The admiral felt a shift inside him, as if the pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. His mind raced to comprehend the implications of what he was witnessing. Humans were often thought of as a chaotic species ruled by emotion and impulses, but this child was the complete opposite. Their decisions were cold, calculated, and precise. The admiral's fingers tapped nervously on the armrest of his chair, his thoughts spinning faster than he could process them. Humans had always been seen as unpredictable, but now he began to wonder if that unpredictability was a form of genius, one that allowed them to adapt and thrive in ways other species could not. Every human might have the same potential to think like this child, and if that was true, then the entire galaxy could be underestimating them. He had thought humanity's strength lay in their numbers and their technology, but now he was not so sure. Their true strength might lie in something far deeper, something invisible and impossible to predict. As the child's final move in the simulation crushed the last remnants of the virtual enemy, the Admiral leaned back in his chair, lost in thought. The game was over, but the questions in his mind had only just begun to form. Could humanity's greatest strength be their ability to adapt, to think beyond the ordinary? Could it be that this child was only the first glimpse of what humans were truly capable of? If so, then the Thor Empire might be facing a threat that no one had anticipated. The Admiral couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen. The child was now facing a new level of the game, where the virtual enemy was no longer just a scattered force, but a powerful fleet of alien warships. The stakes were higher, the challenges more difficult, yet the child showed no signs of panic. Instead, the Admiral saw something extraordinary. The child analyzed the situation with the calm precision of a seasoned commander. They took a moment to assess the situation, as if calculating the most efficient course of action to destroy the enemy forces with minimal risk. The Admiral had seen this sort of careful evaluation in the best generals and military tacticians. It was the hallmark of someone who could think multiple steps ahead, someone who could anticipate the movements of the enemy before they even made them, and here was a human child doing it with the same level of composure, as though it was second nature. The Admiral's mind raced. Could it be possible that humanity's military potential lay not in their technology, but in their ability to think this way naturally? It was a terrifying thought, one that he hadn't considered before. The game's difficulty escalated rapidly, and the child's tactics evolved just as quickly. They used feints to lure the enemy's main fleet into one trap, while secretly preparing a flanking force to strike from behind at the perfect moment. The Admiral had seen this tactic used in real-life battles, but never by someone so young. He had never expected to witness a child executing such an intricate and sophisticated maneuver. Yet there it was, the child's forces were systematically dismantling the enemy with an elegance that would have impressed even the most experienced Thor commanders. The Admiral's unease deepened as he realized that this child's instincts were not the result of chance, but of an innate ability to outthink an opponent. As the child's fleet closed in on the enemy's last stronghold, the Admiral's eyes widened in disbelief. The child wasn't just defeating the enemy, they were forcing them into a position of total surrender. The enemy had nowhere to escape, nowhere to retreat. The game was almost over. The child's final move would be the decisive blow, and yet the Admiral was no longer sure it was just a game. As the child issued the final command to launch a decisive strike on the enemy's command ship, the Admiral felt a chill run down his spine. He had witnessed many battles in his time, and he had seen great tacticians at work, but never had he seen someone orchestrate a victory with such raw brilliance and instinct. The simulation ended with the enemy forces annihilated in one flawless maneuver. The child sat back in their chair, eyes wide with excitement, but also with the quiet confidence of someone who had just completed a task they knew they could accomplish all along. The Admiral took a deep breath as the screen faded to black, and the child's image disappeared from view. For a moment he simply stared at the empty screen, lost in thought. Everything he had believed about humanity was now being questioned. Had he misunderstood them entirely? Could it be that the true strength of the human race lay not in their technology or numbers, but in their minds, in their ability to think with an adaptability and cunning that no other species could match? If this child was any indication, the answer was terrifyingly clear. The Admiral's fingers hovered over the console, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just witnessed. Humanity was not the weak, chaotic species he had once assumed them to be. They were a species capable of evolving, learning, and adapting with frightening speed. And if this child was any representation of the future of humankind, then the Thor Empire may have made a grave mistake underestimating them. The Admiral could no longer shake the feeling that he was witnessing something truly unprecedented. He had studied countless species over his long career and had seen them react to challenges in predictable ways. Humans, however, were something else entirely. This child's gameplay was not an isolated incident. It was a signal, something deeper about the human psyche, a primal instinct that drove them to outwit and survive at any cost. The Admiral was no longer certain that the child's skill was the result of mere talent or luck. There was something more behind it, something that suggested humanity had a unique capacity for strategy and warfare, a gift that no other species seemed to share. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The child's actions in the game had mirrored the tactics of some of the greatest commanders in history, but the real shock came when the Admiral ordered his most seasoned officers to attempt the same simulation. Surely, their experience would give them the advantage against a simple human child. Yet when the Thor officers began the simulation, they were swiftly defeated. The complexity of the enemy forces overwhelmed them in ways they hadn't anticipated. They couldn't predict the child's strategies, much less counter them. The Admiral's mind was spinning as he watched his officers struggle helplessly. The more he thought about it, the more it became apparent to him that humanity possessed something far beyond their technology or their resources. It wasn't their weapons or ships that made them dangerous, it was their minds. The Admiral ran through the simulation results again in disbelief. The same child who had been so easily dismissed as a mere player of games had just outsmarted the Thor military elite in a simulated battle. The realization hit him hard, and it was a bitter one. Humans had evolved to be fighters, not just in the physical sense, but in the mental sense as well. The way they thought about conflict was fundamentally different from every other species in the galaxy. They didn't just play to win, they played to survive. The Admiral leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping nervously on the console as he processed the data. What kind of species was humanity? Really, he had seen their history, their constant cycles of war and destruction, but he had always dismissed it as mere chaos, something born out of emotional instability. Yet what he had witnessed was something more organized, something far more dangerous. Humanity's chaotic nature wasn't a weakness at all, it was their strength. They thrived in uncertainty and used it to their advantage. While other species crumbled under pressure, humans adapted. They learned, and they found ways to outthink their enemies. A shiver ran down his spine as he recalled the child's final move in the simulation, the way they had baited the enemy into a trap and destroyed them with one calculated strike. It wasn't just a game to the child. It was a reflection of something deeply ingrained within them, a survival instinct that could manifest in ways the Admiral had never expected. This was no simple game of virtual warfare. It was a training ground. It was preparing them for something much bigger, something real. The Admiral's mind raced with implications as the screen flickered and the child's image disappeared. He had to warn the Empire. But how could he explain this? It wasn't just a child playing a simulation, it was something more, something that suggested humanity might be more prepared for conflict than anyone had ever realized. He had underestimated them. But now it was clear humanity was not to be taken lightly. They had a strategic mind that could rival the greatest tacticians of the galaxy. And if this was just one child, imagine what the rest of the human race could accomplish. The Admiral leaned forward, his fingers brushing the console. Once more his thoughts filled with unease. This discovery could change everything. Humanity was not a species to be ignored. They were a threat far more subtle and dangerous than he had ever anticipated. The Admiral found himself increasingly fixated on the implications of what he had seen. It was no longer just about a game, or even just about one child. The more he replayed the simulation, the more he realized that this wasn't just a display of tactical skill. It was something far deeper, something instinctive. The child's decisions weren't simply reactions to the game's mechanics. They were a reflection of an inherent understanding of warfare that went beyond learned behavior. It was as if the child's mind had been built to think strategically from birth, as if this kind of thinking was embedded in their very biology. The Admiral had witnessed great commanders in the Thor Empire, skilled tacticians who had honed their craft over decades of battle and strategy, yet none of them had the same natural flair for anticipating their enemies' moves as this child did. There was something almost primal about it, as though the child was tapping into a long-forgotten part of humanity's evolution, a survival instinct. forged through millennia of struggle and conflict. The Admiral couldn't help but wonder if this child's play was not just a preparation for war, but a demonstration of humanity's entire species-wide capacity for it. As he continued to think about the child's actions, the Admiral's perspective began to shift. He remembered his previous assumptions about humanity, their tendency toward chaos and disorganization, how they seemed to stumble through life without direction. But now he saw them differently. Humans were not just disordered and reckless. They were deeply adaptive. Their ability to learn from failure and their knack for devising new strategies in moments of crisis was what made them so dangerous. This child was proof of that, and the Admiral now saw that humanity's unpredictability wasn't a flaw, it was their greatest strength. The child's gameplay had not only outmatched the Thor elite, it had done so with a kind of effortless grace that suggested it wasn't a rare exception. It was a natural outgrowth of the human mind. The child's instincts were honed to recognize patterns, to understand cause and effect in ways that most species could never achieve. It was as if the child had internalized the lessons of survival before they had even learned to speak, before they had even been taught to walk. This was the natural state of humans, to think in terms of strategy and survival as second nature. The Admiral was struck by the realization that every human from birth was likely capable of this level of strategic thought. If it was possible for a child this young to process and respond to complex military simulations in such a sophisticated manner, what kind of tactics might an adult human be capable of? He recalled the reports he had received on humanity's military forces. Their battlefield strategies were already formidable for their level of technology. But what if the true power of their military was not in their weapons or technology, but in the minds of the soldiers who wielded them? The Admiral began to fear that he had overlooked something crucial. Humanity's military potential wasn't just growing, it was instinctual. As he ran through the possible consequences of this new understanding, the Admiral felt a cold weight settle in his chest. If humanity's survival instinct was this deeply ingrained, if their minds were wired for conflict in ways that no other species had ever experienced, then the galaxy had completely underestimated them. He thought about the hundreds of worlds that had fallen under this Thor's rule, the countless species that had been subdued with superior firepower and strategy. But could the same tactics work on a species like humanity, a species that seemed to rise to the occasion when faced with overwhelming odds? Could this Thor truly defeat such a resilient and adaptable species? The Admiral exhaled deeply, the weight of the realization heavy on his mind. He had always prided himself on being a master strategist, but now he wondered if his understanding of warfare was limited by the very assumptions that had once led him to underestimate humanity. They weren't just survivors, they were born for war in a way that no one had expected, and now he was starting to realize that humanity's future might be one of conquest, not just survival. They were ready to fight, and the Thor might not be prepared for what would come next. The Admiral paced back and forth, his mind racing as he reviewed the data from his observations. Everything he had once believed about humanity was unraveling before him. They weren't just a chaotic species stumbling through their development. They were driven by something deeper, a force that made them unpredictable and dangerous. He thought back to the humans' history of conflict, how they had risen from the ashes of their own wars and emerged stronger, more resilient each time, with a relentless drive to survive and adapt. No matter the cost, the Admiral couldn't help but wonder if their ability to learn from failure was the key to their potential for victory. As he sat at his desk once more, he reviewed the simulation again and again. The child's every move was etched into his mind, the tactical brilliance, the unyielding focus, the precision in every decision. He had seen military commanders with decades of experience make moves that mirrored this child's intuition, but they had all been products of years of training and war. And yet here was this human child exhibiting that same natural brilliance, as though born for this kind of challenge. It wasn't just impressive, it was unsettling. It suggested that this was a deeply ingrained trait, something that lay dormant within every human being, waiting to be awakened by the right circumstances. The Admiral had seen humans rise to power before through their sheer numbers, their innovation, their technology, but this was different. This child didn't rely on overwhelming force or advanced weaponry to achieve victory. They relied on something much more fundamental: their mind and their ability to outthink their enemies. Humans weren't just surviving through brute force or luck, they were surviving by evolving constantly, adapting to new challenges in ways that no one else seemed capable of. He had heard whispers of human ingenuity before, but seeing it firsthand was something else entirely. He thought of the tactics he had seen in the simulation, how the child had anticipated every enemy move before it even happened, how they had been able to outsmart their opponents at every turn. And he realized that humanity's greatest strength was not just in their technology or their numbers, but in their unparalleled ability to adapt and think strategically. The Admiral's fear grew as he considered the possibility that every human, regardless of age or experience, might possess this hidden potential. It was an edge that no other species had, and it was a dangerous one. He ran his fingers over the console as a cold shiver ran down his spine. The implications were staggering. If humanity's military potential lay in their minds, if every human had the capacity to think with this kind of instinctive brilliance, then the Thor Empire was in trouble. Their approach to domination had always been one of superior technology and overwhelming force, but it was clear now that this approach might not work on a species that didn't think like every other species. Humanity had the ability to fight back, not just with weapons, but with strategy. The Admiral began to question everything he had known about warfare. Was the Thor Empire really ready to face a species like humanity? He began to reconsider the plans he had set in motion for the next phase of conquest. Should he rethink their entire strategy? Should they be moving cautiously, trying to understand humanity better before engaging? Or was it too late? Was the Empire already underestimating them again? He had been so focused on the strength of his Empire's armada, so certain that their technology would make them unstoppable, but this new understanding of humanity's potential made him question everything he had known about war. As he sat there in the war room, alone with his thoughts, the Admiral knew that the next steps would be critical. But one thing was clear: humanity was no longer just a simple species to be conquered. They were a species capable of changing the course of the galaxy, and the Admiral now understood that the real war had only just begun. The Admiral sat in silence, contemplating the future of the galaxy. His hands rested on the cold surface of the command table, his fingers lightly tapping against it as his mind swirled with possibilities. The simulations, the tactics, and the child's natural brilliance had revealed something to him that he could no longer ignore. Humanity was not the enemy he had originally believed them to be. In fact, they might be more of a challenge than the Thor Empire could handle. Their strength was not in their numbers, their technology, or their military might, but in their minds. The ability to think, adapt, and outwit those around them was their true weapon, and it made them unpredictable in ways the Admiral hadn't anticipated. The Admiral realized that humanity's real power was in their capacity for innovation under pressure. They were not bound by tradition or the standard doctrines of warfare. Like the other species, this Thor had encountered humanity's willingness to embrace new ideas, even when those ideas went against the norm, made them nearly impossible to predict. It was a trait he had never witnessed before among any other species. The child's simulation had been a perfect example of this. The child wasn't just playing a game. They were evolving their approach to warfare in real time, thinking beyond what any system could program or simulate. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to suppress the growing sense of dread that had taken root inside him. He had thought of the Thor Empire as an unstoppable force that had conquered countless worlds with the sheer weight of their military prowess. But now he understood that this might not be enough to defeat humanity. What would happen when they faced an enemy that didn't rely on brute strength, but instead used their minds to find ways to counter and overcome even the most formidable forces? Humanity's unpredictability was its greatest weapon, and it was one the Thor Empire had never been prepared for. The Admiral stood abruptly, his mind racing. He had to report his findings to the Emperor, but how could he explain that his entire understanding of warfare had been shaken by the actions of a single human child? He had underestimated them. And now he realized that the galaxy had done the same. Humanity had been dismissed as insignificant, primitive, a species that could be easily defeated by superior force. But the Admiral knew now that the Thor Empire was facing something far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated, a species whose minds were their greatest strength. And if humanity's potential was as limitless as he feared, the galaxy would never be the same. As the Admiral prepared to address the Council, he knew there was no turning back. The Empire had to make a choice: continue to underestimate humanity and face inevitable defeat, or reconsider everything and develop new strategies for dealing with a species that could outthink them at every turn. He had seen the future of warfare, and it was no longer defined by strength or technology. It was defined by intellect and strategy. The game had changed completely. He took a deep breath and stepped into the council chamber, ready to deliver the news, but in his heart, he knew that this wasn't just about one species anymore. This was about the galaxy itself, and whether this Thor could adapt to a new kind of warfare before humanity forced them to learn the hard way. He had seen the child's brilliance, and now he understood that humanity's rise would be inevitable, whether the Empire was prepared or not.